Back when I was a boy, things were different. We didn't have fast food on every corner, and grocery stores didn't overflow with choices. During the Great Depression, money was tight, food was even tighter, but families, well, we stuck together. Dinner wasn't about what you wanted, it was about what you had, and somehow we made it work. We turned simple ingredients into meals that warmed the soul. We shared whatever was on the table, even if it wasn't much. Today, I want to take you back to the 1930s, back to a time when our grandparents, and maybe your great-grandparents, cooked with heart, stretched every penny, and never let anything go to waste. These 25 meals weren't fancy. They weren't expensive. But they got us through some of the hardest times America ever saw. And more than that, they taught us lessons we still need today. Lessons about gratitude, resourcefulness, and love. So pull up a chair and let me tell you about the meals that fed more than just our bellies. They fed our families, our strength, and our hope. Number 1. Potato soup. Potato soup was one of those meals that showed up again and again during the Great Depression. It was simple, cheap, and reliable. But to us, it was more than just a bowl of hot liquid. It was a symbol of survival. We started with water. If we were lucky, we had a bit of meat bone or broth to flavor it. But most times, it was just water. Potatoes were peeled and chopped, sometimes with the skins left on to stretch the volume. If we had an onion, even a small one, Mama would dice it up fine and toss it in. A little salt, a little pepper, and if the stars aligned, maybe a splash of milk at the end to make it creamy. That pot would simmer for hours, filling the kitchen with a smell that made your stomach growl. I remember sitting at the table watching the steam rise from my bowl, listening to the wind whistle outside. On nights like that, we didn't feel poor. We felt cared for. And if there was bread to dip in that soup, even just the heel of a loaf, it became a feast. No one asked for seconds out loud, but we all hoped there was enough for one more scoop. Number 2. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was a staple, plain and honest. It took very little to make, which made it perfect for hard times. You would boil water, stir in cornmeal slowly, and keep it moving until it thickened into a warm, heavy porridge. Some folks called it gruel, but we just called it dinner. In the mornings, if there was any left, Mama would slice the cold mush into squares and fry them in bacon grease or lard. The outside would crisp up nicely, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. We often ate it with syrup if we had any, or a spoonful of jelly from last year's preserves. Other times, just a sprinkle of salt had to do. It filled you up and stuck with you all day. There was something about the smell of it frying in the pan, early in the morning when the sun was just peeking through the curtains. It was comforting. It told us that no matter how tough the world outside was, we were going to get through it together. It wasn't just a meal. It was part of our rhythm, part of what made those long days bearable. Number 3. Rice and milk. Rice and milk was one of those dishes that sat right on the line between meal and dessert, and we kids were always hoping it'd show up after supper. But more often than not, it was supper. We cooked the rice until it was soft and fluffy, then poured warm milk over it, sometimes just enough to cover, other times enough to make it almost like a soup. If we had sugar, we added a spoonful. If we had cinnamon or nutmeg, even better. But usually it was plain, and that was fine. It was warm, gentle, and soothing. I remember eating it by the fireplace in the winter, curled up with a blanket, holding that bowl in both hands. It felt safe. It felt like home. It didn't matter that it came from the most basic ingredients in the cupboard. It mattered that Mama made it with care. Rice was cheap, and milk, well, it was precious. That made this meal feel like something special, even though it was made out of near nothing. It taught us that comfort isn't about cost, it's about love. Number 4. Oatmeal again and again. There's no meal I remember more from those years than oatmeal. We had it almost every day, sometimes twice. Rolled oats were affordable and lasted a long time if you bought them in bulk. Mama would boil up a big pot first thing in the morning, stirring slow over the stove while we got ready for the day. Sometimes it was thick, sometimes thin, depending on how far she needed to stretch it. If we had milk, we added a splash. If we had apples from the tree, she'd dice one in. A bit of sugar or a drop of molasses turned it into something close to a treat. But often it was just oats, salt, and water. We didn't complain. It was warm, and it kept us full until the evening. Leftovers were never thrown out. They were fried up or reheated with a bit more water the next day. I can still hear the sound of the wooden spoon scraping the pot and the way the smell would creep down the hallway, waking you up slow and easy. Oatmeal may not seem like much today, but back then it was steady. And steady meant survival. Number 5. Hot water cornbread. Hot water cornbread was a kind of magic. It needed no eggs, no milk, no baking powder, just cornmeal, boiling water, and the will to make something out of almost nothing. Mama would mix it in a bowl until it reached just the right thickness, not too loose, not too stiff, then shape it into little patties with her hands. Into the skillet they went, sizzling in whatever fat we had saved, bacon grease, lard, sometimes even drippings from a can of meat. The outside browned to a crisp, and the inside stayed soft and warm. You could eat it with beans, with greens, with soup, or just plain with a little syrup or honey if we were lucky. I loved the way they felt in your hands, rough but warm, like the work-worn palms of my father. They were small, simple, and absolutely unforgettable. Even today, whenever I catch the scent of cornmeal hitting hot grease, I am taken right back to that little kitchen, the worn-out table, and the sound of Mama humming as she flipped each patty. That was food made from heart, not wealth. Number 6. Tomato gravy over bread or rice. Now this one brings back memories of early mornings and empty cupboards. Tomato gravy sounds fancy to some, but for us, it was born out of pure necessity. We would start with some flour and fat, usually bacon grease if we had it. That went into the pan to make a roux, stirred carefully until it turned golden. Then we poured in canned tomatoes, sometimes whole, sometimes crushed, depending on what was available. We'd add a little salt, a bit of pepper, maybe even a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity. Let it simmer until it thickened into a warm, rich gravy. We'd serve it over day-old biscuits, pieces of dry bread, or plain white rice. That sauce soaked into every crumb, making even the stalest bread feel like something special. I remember sitting at the table, watching my father mop up the last bit with his fingers. That gravy wasn't just a topping, it was the meal. And you better believe every drop got eaten. It taught us that flavor didn't come from money. It came from care, time, and a bit of ingenuity. Number 7. Fried potatoes and onions. This was a meal that worked morning, noon, or night. We sliced potatoes thin, skins on. No one peeled them, unless they were fancy. Into the pan they went with hot grease, and if we had an onion, we'd slice that in too. The smell alone could draw folks into the kitchen. Onions would caramelize and mix with the crispy bits of potato until everything turned golden brown. It was the kind of food that filled your belly and made you feel warm from the inside out. Sometimes, if there were leftovers, we'd crack an egg into the pan the next morning, stir everything together, and call it breakfast. It was greasy, it was hearty, and it felt like a real meal, even if there was not a speck of meat on the plate. I remember Mama standing at the stove, flipping those potatoes carefully, always making sure the edges were just right. We'd gather around the table, each of us with a plate piled high, and we'd eat slow. Not because we wanted to, but because we didn't want it to end. It was that good. Number 8. Buttered noodles. Buttered noodles may sound like something from a child's plate today, but during the Great Depression, it was a lifesaver. When times were hard and cupboards were bare, we leaned on what we called belly fillers, and this was one of them. We'd boil up whatever pasta we had. Most times it was egg noodles, sometimes broken spaghetti, and toss it in a pot with butter or lard. A bit of salt and pepper went in, maybe even a touch of garlic if we were lucky. That was it. No sauce, no cheese, no extras, just buttered noodles served hot and simple. It was the kind of meal that brought everyone to the table with little fuss. And the funny thing is, no one complained. We were just grateful to have something warm to eat. Sometimes Mama would fry the noodles the next day, getting the edges crispy in a pan. That made it feel like a whole new dish. And I'll tell you what, it may not sound like much, but when your stomach's empty and the world feels uncertain, a bowl of buttered noodles can feel like comfort itself. Number 9. Onion sandwiches. Now, this one might turn some heads today, but back then, onion sandwiches were more common than you'd think. Bread was cheap, and onions were even cheaper, especially if you grew them yourself. When meat wasn't available, and that was most of the time, we'd slice up a raw onion, lay it between 2 slices of white bread, and sprinkle it with salt and pepper. Sometimes, we'd add a smear of lard or butter if there was any. And that was lunch. I'll be honest with you, it wasn't always pleasant. That onion bite could be sharp and your eyes would water before you even took a bite. But it was food. It filled a hole, and it gave you energy to keep going. We learned early not to complain, because complaining didn't make food appear. You just ate what you had and moved on. Funny thing is, I came to like it. There was something about the crunch of the onion, the softness of the bread. It felt honest. It reminded us that a meal didn't have to be rich to be real. Number 10. Tomato sandwiches. Summertime meant one thing: tomatoes. Big, juicy, garden-grown tomatoes that soaked your bread the second you laid a slice down. We'd pick them fresh from the vine, still warm from the sun, and slice them thick. 2 pieces of bread, usually plain white, sometimes homemade, became the base. A sprinkle of salt, maybe a thin spread of mayonnaise if we had any, and then those slices of tomato right in the middle. That was it. But oh, what a meal. You'd bite in, and the juice would run down your chin, the bread would go soft, and for a moment, you'd forget all the trouble in the world. There was something so satisfying about the sweetness of that tomato, mixed with the salt and the softness of the bread. And more than that, it tasted like summer, like home. We might not have had meat or fancy spreads, but when tomatoes were in season, we had plenty, and we were grateful. That sandwich taught us to enjoy what was growing right in front of us, and to never take even the simplest gifts of nature for granted. Number 11. Canned pork and beans. Canned pork and beans were one of those rare items that felt like a luxury back then. A single can could feed several people if you stretched it right. Most of the time, that pork was just a tiny square of fat floating near the top, but we treated it like gold. Mama would warm the beans slowly on the stove, stirring gently so they would not burn. Sometimes she added chopped onion or a splash of ketchup to stretch the flavor. If we had a slice of bread or leftover cornbread, we'd scoop the beans right onto that and eat it like an open-faced sandwich. It wasn't much, but it filled you up. I remember how we'd scrape the sides of the pot to get every last bit. No one talked much during those meals. We were too busy enjoying something warm, something with flavor. It wasn't about the ingredients. It was about how it made you feel. A simple can of beans shared with your family around a worn-out table could remind you that you were going to be okay. That hope still lingers when I smell beans on the stove today. Number 12. Pinto beans and cornbread. Now this here was a classic. Pinto beans and cornbread were more than just a meal. They were a way of life. Dried beans were cheap and lasted forever in the pantry. Mama would soak them overnight and cook them slow all day long until they got soft and creamy. She would season them with salt, pepper, maybe a bay leaf or 2, and if we had a ham hock or a bit of bacon fat, that went in too. The smell would fill the house by late afternoon. Meanwhile, she would whip up a skillet of cornbread. No sugar, just cornmeal, flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and whatever fat she had. That hot, crusty cornbread came out of the oven just as the beans were ladled into bowls. We crumbled the cornbread right on top and let it soak up the juice. It was earthy, hearty, and honest. There was no pretending with this dish. It gave you strength. It gave you comfort. And when you were poor and tired, that combination of beans and bread made you feel like the richest soul in the world. Number 13, dandelion green salad. When gardens were empty and store shelves were out of reach, nature still found a way to feed us. One of those ways came in the form of dandelion greens. Most folks today think of them as weeds, but back then they were food. We would go out early in the morning and pick the young leaves before they got too bitter. Mama would wash them thoroughly, then toss them with vinegar, salt, a pinch of sugar, and if we were blessed, a splash of bacon grease or a crumbled piece of fried fatback. That was our salad. Served cold, sharp, and slightly sour, it woke up your tongue and your appetite. It reminded you that even in the worst of times, the land could still provide. I used to think it was magic, how something growing wild in the backyard could feed the family. That little bowl of greens taught us to be resourceful, to look closer, and to never underestimate what was right under our feet. I still smile when I see dandelions sprouting through the cracks today. Number 14, boiled cabbage and potatoes. This was about as simple as it gets, but it filled the house with a smell that meant home. Cabbage and potatoes were cheap, filling, and stored well through the winter. We would chop up a head of cabbage, cube a few potatoes, and boil them together in a big pot. Sometimes we added a spoonful of lard or a bit of salt pork if we had it, just to give it some flavor. But even without meat, it worked. The cabbage would soften until it was silky, and the potatoes broke apart just enough to thicken the broth. We ate it with a spoon, drank the broth from the bottom of the bowl, and wiped our mouths with the back of our hands. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot. It was enough. And on days when the cold crept through the cracks in the walls, that bowl of cabbage and potatoes felt like a blanket. It was a meal made of resilience. It taught us to appreciate what was available and to understand that nourishment didn't always need to come from something expensive. It just needed to come from the heart. Number 15, goulash, American style. Goulash was our version of a warm, filling stew made from whatever was on hand. It usually started with elbow macaroni, boiled just right. Then Mama would toss it into a skillet with a bit of tomato, maybe canned, maybe ketchup, and stretch it with chopped onion, garlic, and, if we were real lucky, a bit of ground beef. But meat wasn't always part of it. Sometimes it was just pasta, tomato, and seasoning. And still it tasted like a feast. She might add a dash of chili powder or paprika if any was left in the tin. It wasn't Hungarian goulash, not by a long shot. But it was warm, saucy, and it stuck to your ribs. We would scoop it onto plates, steam rising, and dig in like it was something special. And it was. It was the kind of dish that made a little feel like a lot. I always loved how it tasted even better the next day, when all the flavors had soaked in. That dish reminded us that improvisation could still taste like home, and that survival could have spice. Number 16, scrambled eggs over bread. Now, you would not think of scrambled eggs as anything fancy, and back then, they weren't. But when eggs were hard to come by, one or two could feed the whole family if you stretched them just right. We'd crack an egg, 2 if we were lucky, and beat it with a little water or milk to make it go further. Mama would toast some bread, or sometimes just warm up slices of day-old bread in a dry skillet. Then she'd scramble those eggs, slow and gentle in a bit of grease, spooning them right over the bread like it was gravy. That soft egg would soak into the toast, and for a moment, You felt like you were eating something special. We didn't have bacon on the side or fresh fruit to go with it. But no one cared. That little bite of protein gave us strength. And more than that, it gave us hope. I still remember the taste of those eggs. Simple, salty, rich in a way that had nothing to do with ingredients and everything to do with the love that put them on the plate. Number 17. Lard sandwiches. This one might sound strange today, but during the Depression, a lard sandwich could be the difference between going to bed hungry or full. Lard was cheap and widely used because it could be saved and reused, and it made everything taste better. When there was no meat in the house and nothing but bread and fat in the kitchen, Mama would spread a thin layer of lard on a slice of bread, sometimes two if we had enough, and sprinkle a bit of salt and pepper on top. That was lunch. If we were lucky, maybe a slice of onion or a little sugar got added for variety. The bread was usually stale, but the warmth of the lard made it soft again. It sounds meager, and it was. But it kept our stomachs from aching, and it reminded us that even the plainest food could have purpose. We didn't think about cholesterol or calories. We thought about making it through the week. And somehow that sandwich helped us do just that. Number 18. Creamed corn on toast. Creamed corn on toast was one of those meals that you could throw together quickly, especially when there wasn't much in the house. We usually had a can or two of creamed corn sitting in the cupboard. Mama would heat it gently on the stove, stirring slow to keep it from burning. Sometimes she added a splash of milk to stretch it further, or a pinch of salt to bring out the flavor. Meanwhile, she would toast a few slices of bread, whatever was left, often the ends of the loaf, and lay them out on each plate. Then came the corn, spooned hot over the toast until it soaked right through. It was soft, sweet, and warm. We didn't think of it as poor food. We just thought of it as dinner. I used to eat mine with a fork and a knife like it was something fancy. It may not seem like much now, but back then, that simple plate filled your belly and made you feel like someone cared enough to make sure you ate. And that was more than enough. Number 19. Bacon, grease, everything. Bacon was rare, but bacon grease? That was sacred. We kept a jar of it on the stove, sometimes two. Nothing got wasted, not even the drippings from the pan. That grease went into everything. Fried potatoes, cornbread batter, vegetables, gravies. It added flavor when there wasn't much else to work with. Sometimes, Mama would even spread a little on toast, especially if we didn't have butter. Just a dab and a sprinkle of salt could turn dry bread into something savory and satisfying. We called it poor man's butter, and it did the job. That little jar of bacon grease was like gold. It held the memory of Sunday breakfast, the smell of something special, even when the bacon itself was long gone. And when we used it in cooking, it felt like we were bringing that memory back to life. It taught us that flavor could come from scraps, and that with enough care, even the smallest leftover could make a meal taste like home. Number 20. Mock apple pie made with crackers. Now this one here was pure ingenuity. During the Great Depression, apples could be expensive or simply out of season. But folks still craved something sweet, something comforting. So we got creative. Mama found a recipe for what she called mock apple pie, made without a single apple. The secret? Saltine crackers. She'd crush them up, layer them in a pie crust, and pour over a hot syrup made from sugar, water, lemon juice, cinnamon, and a pinch of cream of tartar. It smelled just like the real thing when it baked. When it came out of the oven, golden brown and bubbling, you'd swear there were apples in it. The crackers softened and took on the texture of fruit, soaking up all that sweet, spiced syrup. Served with a dollop of canned whipped cream, if we had it, it tasted like hope. We didn't have much, but we still made room for dessert, even if it came from the bottom shelf of the pantry. That pie wasn't just clever. It was a reminder that joy could be baked out of almost nothing. Number 21. Eggless pancakes. Pancakes were a special treat growing up, but during the Depression, we did not always have the ingredients for a full recipe. No eggs, no milk, sometimes not even sugar. So what did we do? We made eggless pancakes. Just flour, water, a pinch of salt, and baking powder. Mama would stir it all together until it formed a thin batter, then pour it onto a hot skillet greased with lard. They didn't rise much, and they were thinner than the flapjacks you see today. But they cooked fast and fed the whole family. Sometimes we added a mashed banana or a bit of cinnamon if we were lucky. Most times, we ate them plain or with a spoon of homemade jam. I remember once, we had just enough molasses for a drizzle on top. And that morning felt like Christmas. It wasn't about fluff or fluffiness. It was about filling your belly and starting the day with something warm. Those pancakes taught us that a flat batter and a hot pan could go a long, long way. Number 22. Lettuce sandwiches. You might laugh, but when there was no meat in sight and no money to spare, we made do with what we had. And sometimes, that meant lettuce between 2 slices of bread. On days when the garden gave us a good head of iceberg or leaf lettuce, Mama would wash the leaves carefully, pat them dry, and tuck them into slices of bread, sometimes with a little mayonnaise or just a sprinkle of salt. If we were lucky, there'd be a slice of tomato or onion to dress it up. Most of the time, it was just bread and lettuce. And you know what? It was still a sandwich. And it still meant we had something to eat. We didn't talk about what we wished we had. We focused on what we did. That sandwich might have been thin, but it was fresh, clean, and honest. And more than once, it carried us through when the fridge was empty and the cupboard was bare. Number 23. Bread and gravy. There's a kind of magic in turning yesterday's scraps into today's comfort. Bread and gravy was exactly that. A warm, humble dish made from the simplest ingredients. If we had drippings from a roast or a bit of fat saved from cooking, Mama would use it to make a roux. She'd stir in a little flour, then add water or milk, whisking until it turned into a smooth, rich gravy. Poured over thick slices of bread, often stale or toasted, it became a full meal. Sometimes we added a cracked egg or a pinch of pepper for flavor. But even plain, it was satisfying. That gravy soaked through the bread, warming your hands and filling your stomach. I remember how quiet the table would get when we ate it. Everyone just grateful to have something hot, something real. We didn't need meat or sides, just gravy and bread, and maybe a story to go with it. It reminded us to never take the small things for granted. Number 24. Depression cake, a wacky cake. Now this here is a cake I'll never forget. We called it wacky cake or depression cake, and it was special. Not because it was fancy, but because it was made without eggs, milk, or butter. Ingredients we rarely had all at once. This cake used just flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, vinegar, oil, and water. Mama would mix it right in the pan, no bowl needed, making 3 little holes for oil, vinegar, and vanilla, then pouring water over the top and stirring it all together with a fork. Into the oven it went, and when it came out, it was soft, rich, and smelled like better times. We'd cut it into squares and savor every bite. Sometimes it was topped with powdered sugar or thin icing if we had cocoa left. It was the taste of celebration on an ordinary day. That cake reminded us that resilience was not just about survival. It was about finding sweetness, even when the world gave you bitterness. And oh, how sweet that slice could be. Number 25. Vegetable soup from scraps. This meal was the very definition of making something out of nothing. Vegetable soup was never the same twice. It depended entirely on what was left. Potato peels, onion tops, cabbage cores, carrot stubs, beans from the garden, maybe a tomato if one was left on the vine. Mama would keep a pot going on the back burner, adding to it each day, simmering whatever she could find. The broth grew richer over time, pulling flavor from bones, herbs, and the bottom of the spice jar. We'd eat it with a slice of bread or just a spoon. Sometimes it was thin and watery, other times hearty and full. But no matter what went into it, that soup always had warmth. It was the taste of resourcefulness, of community, of survival. And as we sat at the table, steam rising and hands clasped in quiet gratitude, that pot of humble soup reminded us we didn't need much to feel full. We just needed each other.